Gun-Free South Africa has called on the Minister of Police, Bheki Cele, and the National Commissioner General Khehla Sitole to urgently strengthen actions to recover and to destroy unwanted and illegally held guns as soon as possible. This was in response, of course, to the latest national crime statistics that revealed that over 20,000 contact crimes were committed using firearms. To talk to us further about this, we joined now via Skype by Gun-Free SA Director Adele Kirsten. Adele, good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for coming through.
Good afternoon, Palesa, and thank you for having us.
So, guns, unlike knives, of course, are controlled by legislation, by law, by regulations. There are protocols that are put in place. Why do we still have, 45% of murders that are firearm related? Is there perhaps some lack of compliance?
I think it's a number of things. I think, firstly, it's a big number. We're talking about almost half of murders in this country in which a gun is used. But I think there are a number of reasons. The one is poor enforcement of the Act, of the Firearms Control Act. And we have seen this over the last 10 years, a weakening in the firearms control management system. So poor enforcement of the Act, not enough being done by the police to recover illegal weapons. So one has to mop up the existing pool of illegal weapons. One has to make sure that your existing legal stocks are also reduced. And then you have to put in place or ensure that the gun law is enforced so that people who are at risk of self-harm and using the gun to injure or kill others are not issued with firearm licenses.
So what should happen now, Adele, in terms of trying to perhaps limit the number of new guns that are entering the market and also perhaps to sort of reduce the existing ones?
So, one has to do both. So it's exactly what you said. You have to mop up the illegal, and government can do that through a firearms amnesty. And the good news is that Parliament has just approved a new amnesty starting from tomorrow until the end of January 2021. But the other is we have to look at strengthening the existing Firearms Control Act. We have to look at what does the evidence tell us about what are the guns that are causing the most harm. And these are usually handguns, overwhelmingly used in the three violent crime categories of murder, attempted murder, and GBH. And so the policymakers and us as an organization that tries to shape and influence policy really need to look at ways in which we limit the licensing of handguns.
So we know that last year in 2019, President Ramaphosa envisioned halving violent crimes in South Africa in the next 10 years. A year or so later, looking at the latest crime stats, would you say that we are on track, or is there still a long way to go?
We've got still a long way to go. I don't think we're on track. I guess it's just been 1 year. Perhaps just the good news is to say that the two bits of good news with this release of these crime stats is that the minister has committed to releasing them quarterly, which is fantastic because that means we can then begin to get more real-time assessment of the change and shifting patterns of crime. But secondly, for the first time, and this is something that civil society has really been lobbying for and advocating for the last 10 years, is there's much more detail in the crime stats. So, for example, around murder, causes, the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, as well as more information around the circumstances. So that's good news. But we know, and this is globally proven across the world, that reducing access to weapons reduces gun deaths. And we did that in 2000 by introducing stricter gun laws, and we almost reduced our murder rate by 50%, but certainly our gun-related murders by 50%. So we've done it before, and it was through strict enforcement of strict gun laws. And then over the last 10 years, we've seen poor compliance increasing fraud and corruption, and a weakening of the enforcement of the Act. So the evidence is there about what works. And we, obviously, it's, nearly 20 years later, so we need to go back and say, what are the loopholes in the gun law? Where do we need to strengthen? And how do we need to improve our policing?
All right, so if we've done it before and it worked for the country, so how do we tighten that going forward? What do we need to do in terms of action and ensuring that lives are saved from guns in South Africa?
So I think there are a number of things. The first is for SABC really to prioritize removing and recovering illegal weapons, whether it's from crime scenes, whether it's through search and seizure, whether it's through holding things like a national firearms amnesty. That has to be a priority. And then I guess the second step is, once these guns are removed, we know that there are low levels of trust with police, because often you hear stories about guns going out through the back door. The police have to really work hard at increasing public trust and ensuring that once weapons are recovered, that the stockpile, the physical space in which guns are stockpiled, and then the auditing process before they're destroyed are absolutely above board and without fault. So that's a second area, is basically to review and strengthen our weapons stockpile and storage facilities. And then the third is amending the Firearms Control Act. And I think really, as I've said earlier, is to look at reducing the risk for people who are at risk. So, for example, we know, again globally, all the evidence shows that people with a history of previous violent behavior and people with a history of problem drinking are most at risk to engage in acts of violence. And if they have a gun, then obviously that increases the lethality. And then lastly, and I guess this is partly under COVID-19 times, is with many communicable diseases like TB, but also COVID-19, it's what's called a notifiable disease. So you have to report it. And this, I think this would be an innovation for South Africa, that gunshots become mandatory to be reported. And that means that you can then monitor the gun-related incidents in real time rather than waiting 6 months for mortuary data or SABC data. So this is something we're really engaging with public health officials on, trauma doctors, to see, is this a route that we can take? And certainly we think it will make a big difference to us understanding where and how gun violence occurs, and once we know that, to know what are the best interventions to reduce that.
All right, Adele, that's where we'll leave it for today. We thank you so much for your time. Adele Kirsten is the Director for Gun Free South Africa, giving reaction to the latest crime statistics as released by the Police Minister, General Bheki earlier this morning.